Hi, everyone. You're watching the 6.6 to 6.8 quiz helper. So question number one, let's dive right in. They want us to solve algebraically for y. This could mean a couple things, but because we're talking about 6.1 to 6.8, we're just solving quadratics. So the first thing that we want to do is actually make it look like a quadratic. So we're going to distribute the y. So y squared plus 4y equals 22 minus 5y. Now we have a y squared, so we're going to bring everything over to the y squared party by subtracting 22 from both sides and adding 5y. So I'm going to add 5y with my other y, but I'm going to realize really quickly that there is not a 22 or a constant that can be added. So he's just going to hang out. He has no one. He's no friend. He has no friends. So y squared plus 9y minus 22. And then everything over here ended up canceling out to be equal to 0, because whenever we have a quadratic, unless we're using inverse operations, which we're clearly not going to do here because of this y term, this b of 9, we're going to just get everything set equal to 0. So we're happy it's set equal to 0. Next thing, I'm going to look at my directions, and it says solve algebraically for y, and it doesn't say round, it doesn't say simplest radical form. So pretty good sign that this is factorable. No GCF here, so I'm guessing it's going to take this form. So let's see, what two numbers multiply to negative 22 but add to positive 9? 11 and 2. Next, we're going to set each of those equal to 0. Each of those factors get set equal to 0, so we get y is equal to negative 11 and y is equal to positive 2. So those are my two answers. It's because I added 2 to both sides over here, and over here I subtracted 11 from both sides. I'm just getting y alone in both of those equations. Okay, question number 2. They want us to find a possible equation for f of x. Well, the first thing that I'm noticing is I want to write down f of x because it says it right here. I'm also going to get my factors from my zeros. So I have a 0 at negative 1, I have a 0 at 2, and I have a 0 at negative 4. So that to me tells me that I have 3 factors. And be careful, the factors are the opposite signs as the zeros. So if I have a minus 4, it would become a plus 4. If I have a minus 1, it would become a plus 1. If I had a positive 2, it becomes a minus 2. Some people want to double distribute, or like even, I don't even know what you would call this. They want to distribute like twice, double distribute twice. That's a nightmare. Leave it in factor form. I'm totally cool with it. You should be too. All right, number 3, find the roots algebraically. Another sign to me that we are not going to have to use any square roots because it doesn't tell me about rounding or, I don't know, like leaving simplest radical form. The first thing that I do notice is that f of x is not set equal to 0. So that's something that's helpful to me. I'm going to try factoring it, and oh my gosh, when I check for a GCF, which I think a lot of people forget to do still, I see it has a GCF of x. So x times x gives me x squared. X times 13 gives me 13x. Now I have my two factors. So I have x equals 0, and I have x minus 13 equaling 0. Lucky for me, that's done. And then I'm going to add 13 to both sides. So I get x is equal to positive 13. Okay, number 4, find the exact value of m algebraically. The directions are kind of, actually, I probably will change these before you take the quiz, or before I even give you this worksheet. But finding the exact value of m algebraically says a couple things to me. As soon as it's saying find an exact value, I think that square roots are going to be involved, because when you find the exact value of something, that means you cannot round. And lo and behold, if I want to get m alone, this is inverse operations all the way. There's not an x term or an m term in this problem. We're left with m is equal to, when you take the square root, you put a plus or minus, square root of 44. Let's write this in simplest radical form, because that is best practice. So we want to find two numbers that multiply to 44. One of them has to be the biggest perfect square of 44. I think that's 4 and 11, right? Because 11 doesn't have any perfect square factors. The whole reason why we did this is so that we could simplify the square root of 4, which is really 2. So 2 square roots of 11. And don't forget the plus minus. Sometimes I see people trying to creep that plus minus in between here. That doesn't happen in these kinds of questions, not when you're taking just the square root of a single number. They happen when you're completing the square sometimes. So do not put the plus minus in between the 2 and square root 11. It just stays out front here all the way through. All right, number 5, solve algebraically for x by completing the square. Oh, hey, we just talked about this. All right, and it says leave your answer in simplest radical form. All right, cool. So we have some work to do. Now, a lot of people want to set it equal to 0. That's great. You definitely don't have to with questions like these, but we want to set it equal to 0 for those of you who are a little iffy on this process. So let's just move that minus 132 back over to the other side. And remember, this is where people get confused. There is a 2-step process that we're going to have to deal with here. So x squared minus 10x, leave some space, minus 132 equals 0. And then in the same exact step, I'm going to fill this in. So write yourself a note that these are both the same step. So what 2 numbers add to negative 10 that are the same? Negative 5 and negative 5. And what is negative 5 times negative 5? That's plus 25. So plus 25 minus 25. Okay? Now we want to combine, 132 and 25 together. What would that be? So 132 and 25 would be negative 157 equaling 0. Okay, so our next step is x minus 5 all squared minus 157 equals 0. There we have like a sort of vertex form. It's not totally vertex form because it's not an equation, not a function. Like this should be an f of x there or a y or something like that. Let's continue solving because it says find the exact value. So x minus 5 all squared is equal to 157. All right, so carrying on. Now we got to get x alone. So we have this cute little format that we're allowed to take the square root of both sides to get rid of that squared here. And we're left with x minus 5 is equal to positive or negative square root of 157. It said to leave it in simplest radical form. Fortunately for us, 157 is prime, so we don't have to simplify it. If that number had factors, we'd have to do something like this over here. Fortunately, we don't. What we do now need to do is move that minus 5 over to the other side. So x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 157. And it's in simplest radical form, again, because the square root of 157 had been prime. But had that number been like 50, we would have broken it down to like the square root of 25 and 2. All right, number 6, find the solutions to each of the quadratic equations, show your work algebraically, and round to the nearest hundredth. Okay, again, rounding to the nearest hundredth means that factoring is probably not an option for us. I'm not even going to go there. Set it equal to 0 and do that thing. So 2x squared minus 142. Oh, this is nice. This is like a inverse operations question, which is great news for us because there's no b term, no middle x term. So we end up with 142 equaling 2x squared. Let's keep undoing. We got to get that x squared alone before we take the square root of both sides, because if I tried to take a square root with that 2 under there, that's bad news. I don't know what the square root of 2 is not a perfect square. That's not going to help us. If I take the square root of 142, what is that? 71 is equal to x squared. And then keep undoing. When you take the square root, you put a plus or minus. So the square root of 71, I would do this on my calculator, which I'm doing off to the side. I want to take the square root of this little guy. So what is this going to be? Oh, my calculator's being crabby right now. Okay. The square root of 71. I just did the square root of 72. That's not going to help me. Is 8.426, blah, 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 blah. So if we wanted to round to the nearest hundredth, that would be the plus or minus, the positive or negative, 8 point, and hundredth would be 4, 3. Notice how we didn't have to simplify that square root. All we had to do was write it in the decimal format because of the directions.